You are listening to Historically, a show where we decolonize history and debunk myths taught in school and corporate media. I'm your host, Isha. Today we have Moss Robeson, who is going to tell us about the CIA and how they funded Nazis in Ukraine, and also talk a little bit about Ukraine's problems today after the Euromaidan revolution.
I think so, yeah.
Hello, Moss. Can you tell us a bit about yourself and how you ended up in Ukraine?
Sure, yeah. No, thank you for having me on this podcast, first of all. But I'm 22 now, and so at the end of high school, did like a sort of stereotypical trip to Europe. I went around. I ended up in Ukraine briefly, and that was the summer of 2013. At the time, I didn't really know anything about Ukraine, but I made friends over there. And then, after I left and they had the protest started, that caused me to, follow up, start to pay attention to what was going on in Ukraine. But at the time, I didn't really know anything. Initially, because I knew people who were participating in it and were in support of those protests. Also, when I went there, everywhere I went, people seemed to talk about their president, Yanukovych, kind of like people do about Trump in the US. Or everyone, I only heard like very negative things about him. So in that time period, I initially discounted things I read online about, neo-Nazis taking part in protests as Russian propaganda. And then afterwards, it came as a big shock to me to find out that, some of the kids I had met were, like, one of them was a history student who was able to kind of act as like a tour guide for me when I was in Kiev and tell me a lot about the history, and just was really great. But then I learned afterwards they go to school, or at least did, in Lviv, which is like the cultural capital of Western Ukraine and sort of the center of Ukrainian nationalism. But they go to school on Stephen Bandera Street. So that kind of caused me to, re-examine everything. And ever since, it's been this rabbit hole of learning more and more about that history.
Okay, let's just quickly mention recently, what did they do to Stephen Bandera in December?
In December?
Yeah.
No, I think that there's been a lot of glorification of Bandera since 2014. So I'm not quite sure what you're referring to in this particular. I've been more and more like also. I'm
referring to Stephen Bandera Day.
Oh, okay. No, you mean for January 1st, his birthday?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. So, his birthday is New Year's. To be honest, as I get more and more absorbed in the history of, Bandera's rehabilitation, I haven't been as caught up with current events. But the government of Ukraine has seemingly increasingly participated in the so-called like Banderization of society. It's not, I kind of think of it similar to like the Donald Trump administration, where Trump himself may not be a neo-Nazi. We don't necessarily have a neo-Nazi government in Washington, but it's certainly one that caters to the far right and to even neo-Nazi like ideas and uplifts those. I think it's a somewhat sort of similar situation in Ukraine in that regard.
So maybe the obvious starting point is, who is Stephen Bandera?
Bandera is, I guess first of all, let me start with the group he was a part of. The Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists was a terrorist group in what is now Western Ukraine, with the brief exception of about a year or so during World War I. What is now Western Ukraine was never under the rule of Moscow or St. Petersburg until as a result of the Nazi-Soviet Pact of 1939. So in the interwar period, that was what is now Western Ukraine was Poland officially. And so it was the Ukrainian minority in Poland that was, radicalized, underwent this process of fascistization, and what Bandera came out of. So the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists was created in the late 20s. By the turn of the 30s, Bandera was an early member. He was younger than me when he got involved. And by the time he was my age, he was a leader of the group in Western Ukraine. And in 1933, he became the leader of the group in Western Ukraine or Poland, depending on what you want to call it. But by that point, the leadership of the group was in exile in Western Europe and in Berlin in particular. But he was their leader in Western Ukraine, and he ordered the assassination of a lot of people, but in particular the interior minister of Poland, which was their most high-profile killing. And for that, he and his deputy, or one of them, Mykola Lebed, were sentenced to life imprisonment. They broke out of the war they broke out once World War II started, and very quickly created a new faction of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, or the OUN, known now as the OUNB for Bandera, which kind of became like the more radical, dominant faction of the group. And then both factions collaborated with the Nazis. Bandera kind of throughout in the 30s sort of became, and World War II kind of became like the spiritual leader of the Ukrainian nationalists in Western Ukraine.
When did they started, I guess in 1941, Germany invaded. And when did they started collaborating with the Nazis?
Well, so the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, it's a little hazy, but actually also that group, the OUN, came out of another terrorist group, its predecessor, Ukrainian Military Organization, or UVO. Both organizations, I guess, starting in the 20s and then into the 30s and 40s, or into World War II, collaborated with the German military intelligence in particular, and that was led by Wilhelm Canaris, who was executed in 1944 for his proximity to the German military conspiracies to kill Hitler. There wasn't, I think the Ukrainian nationalists did not have a friend in Hitler's regime, although they convinced themselves otherwise. And there were factions within Nazi Germany, like Alfred Rosenberg and Canaris, and others who sort of lent support to the idea of Ukrainian independence or supporting the OUN. But at the end of the day, they did not have Berlin's blessings. And so that became a conflict, which sort of really interrupted their collaboration during the war. But then that was reignited at the very end. But the members of the OUNB did collaborate with a whole range of sectors of Nazi Germany, but it was really German military intelligence, the Abwehr, that actually supported the OUN throughout the 30s and so.
Okay, I guess I saw a picture on your Twitter about the OUN sending Jews to the concentration camps. Is that true?
Not quite. Well, so there's a few things I'd say to that. So there was a Gestapo school that Lebed is reported to have been involved with right after he escaped prison. And a lot of those, the pupils of that Gestapo school, of basically they were trained in torture techniques and other stuff. A lot of those people were being trained to be camp guards and other stuff, but apparently also some of Bandera's secret police came out of there. But to my knowledge, the OUN and its factions were not sending Jews to German concentration camps. Although in the middle of the war, or towards the end of it, they created a guerrilla army called the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, and it's pretty much a myth that they fought the Germans. Although most of them defected from. They infiltrated and then defected from the auxiliary German police units that were at the front lines of the what's known as the Shoah by bullet. So they weren't sending Jews to concentration camps; they were shooting them in mass numbers in 1941, 1942, and then joined the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, which was mostly concerned with the ethnic cleansing of Poles, but they also tried to kill as many Jews as they could. And they actually set up their own sort of mock work camps or concentration camps where they were, I think small scale, farms and stuff, but there was actually the only really academic biography that's written about Bandera alleges that, there are some accounts of some Jews running from turning themselves into the Germans because they considered it a lesser evil to, facing the wrath of Ukrainian nationalists who might find them hiding out in the woods and stuff. It's complicated, the relationship between the Germans and the OUN and OUNB, but it was definitely one that they did collaborate, and even when they weren't collaborating, they had a lot of similar aims to, the Ukrainian nationalists kind of absorbed a lot of the same ideas.
Okay, and what can we forward to right after the war? What did the U.S. government do?
So first, what they didn't do is the CIA did not really support Bandera, but they ended up supporting what you can think of as like an emerging anti-Bandera faction of Bandera's organization, and led by Mykola Lebed, who throughout the war was basically the de facto leader of the OUNB in Ukraine, because Bandera and his other deputy, who remained loyal to him, Yaroslav Stetsko, and who was supposed to be like the prime minister of their independent Ukraine, they were briefly or temporarily interned by the Germans as sort of like privileged political prisoners. And in that time, Lebed was in charge of the organization. And so after the war, the OUNB leadership, as I think of it, kind of got used to operating without Bandera's dictatorial oversight. And, so after the war, there was this clash within the OUNB where these two other main factions came out of. So the long story short is the US government didn't support Bandera, but his wartime allies turned post-war rivals. But in long term, it kind of worked to Bandera and his successors' benefit, because, in order to work with Mykola Lebed and others, the US government, the CIA and others really ate up and kind of helped disseminating their version of, or their whitewashed version of history, and let them tell their own history, according to which, they were not only just as opposed to the Germans as the Soviets, but particularly anti-Nazi, and that they not only didn't kill Jews, but that they helped them. And, the CIA recognized Bandera as a fascist Nazi collaborator, but they convinced themselves that, a lot of his deputies were moderate in comparison.
You recovered a book called Ukrainian Nationalism. Do you want to talk about that?
Sure. It's well known. It's not, and I guess it has been largely, sort of discounted for various reasons among historians of Ukraine and Ukrainian nationalism. But it was the first academic book to be written, at least in this country, or at least in English, about the subject. The guy, John A. Armstrong, who was a professor at University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I think during World War II, he was in the army or something. I think he came in contact with the OUNB circles, which formed they moved to, they followed the original OUN leadership to Western Europe after the war. And so he basically wrote his book according to what they told them. The acknowledgement section, he kind of names all these Ukrainian Nazi collaborators and even their German allies, including Alfred Rosenberg's representative to the Wannsee Conference. He wasn't the first to, buy into the whitewashed narrative, but I think he really laid the foundation for academia in the United States and more broadly in the West to just reflect the lies that Western Ukraine's Nazi collaborators have, tried to tell the world. Even today, the Harvard University's director of Ukrainian research, his book on Ukraine, Sergei Ploki, repeats a lot of these sort of myths about the OUN and the Ukrainian insurgent army, such as that they were, 100,000 strong and fought the Germans too. So it's like we still have a lot of these lies about history that largely go back to this book, I think, that Armstrong wrote. But even that was written in the mid-50s. So that was about a decade after U.S. intelligence agencies started collaborating with the OUNB and hearing their side of the story without really caring what anyone else had to say.
And the cost of producing and recording, we need your help. Please become a patron. It is as cheap as $5 a month, and you get exclusive access to all our patron-only content. To become a patron, go to http:// www.patreon.com/historic_Lee. This sounds a lot like the Lithuanian, where they pretended that they fought both the Soviets and the Nazis. But was the U.S. government trying to undermine the Soviet Union when they when they collaborated with the OUN?
Yeah, so I think I think to a large extent the U.S. government tried to do what Nazi Germany tried to do at the end of the war, which is to utilize the Ukrainian insurgent army as a sort of stay-behind group. In case of the Germans, it was to slow down the Red Army as it marched towards Berlin. And I think the UPA, as its acronym is, did manage to tie down the Red Army and slow them a bit. But obviously it didn't, wasn't enough. The last Christmas of the war, or 2 days after Christmas 1944, the Germans parachuted a guy, Yuri Lopatinskiy, into Western Ukraine to make contact with the UPA. And about a year later, he made contact with the Strategic Services Unit, which is like a predecessor to the CIA, and he largely sold them on the idea of their collaborating. And also this important OUNB priest, who negotiated with German intelligence to rekindle their collaboration in 1944 and for Germany to release Bandera and all these other political prisoners that they had in exchange. The guy who brokered that, the CIA he became their principal contact, noting that he had played this leading role. So in negotiating with the Germans. But the US government and the CIA's attempts to use the UPA as this stay behind group already behind the Iron Curtain, as opposed to, most people associate the stay behind groups with the Gladio network in Western Europe in case the Soviet Union or whatever was invaded Western Europe, that they would have these groups there ready to do sabotage, but they're waiting in Western Europe, whereas UPA is already behind the Iron Curtain. But that failed drastically, and so by the early 50s they gave up on that. The main thing they did after that with Ukrainians was they illegally smuggled Michael Lebed, this war criminal trained by the Gestapo, and they knew he was trained by the Gestapo. It's one of the things I think they liked about him is they smuggled him to the US.
UPA?
Oh, sorry. Or no, the CIA or State Department. It's a little unclear who exactly, but he was smuggled to the US by the US government illegally, and the CIA put him in charge of this Ukrainian research corporation to basically, send propaganda into the Soviet Union or Soviet Ukraine to promote nationalism in Soviet Ukraine. But what's really messed up about that, I think, in part, is that there was a memo, I think it was in 1967, where they acknowledged some of that material was going to make its way into the Ukrainian American community too. So it's the CIA, I think they actually, the CIA isn't supposed to operate domestically and not supposed to, propagandize US citizens. But they considered a loophole for the anti-Soviet emigre groups in the United States. The Ukrainian American community was basically, and other Eastern European immigrant groups were considered fair game. And although they largely were headquartered, the publishing corporation was centered in New York and Munich, but they had an office, I think, in Munich, basically for that get around in case that was going to be an issue, that their CIA is funding a propaganda network in New York, or was. But it was, it's the proponents of that research corporation called Prologue considered it extremely successful. I don't know. I think it's kind of unclear to what extent, what effect it really had on Soviet Ukrainians who, I think the vast majority of them totally rejected the OUN and OUNB's ideology and politics, and it was completely foreign to them. But the Prologue, there was the U.S. government had a very much a moderating sort of influence on the Ukrainian Nazi collaborators that brought here. So they toned down their rhetoric a lot, but they still like propagated these lies about their past.
A lot of them were wanted war criminals, right? The Soviet Union asked for them and they didn't give it to them.
Mm-hmm. So like I said, the CIA didn't support Bandera, but before that, the U.S. Counterintelligence Corps, so like U.S. military intelligence, did shield Bandera from being turned over to the Soviets, who wanted him as a war criminal, because they felt that it would ruin their relationship or their ability to work with other Ukrainian nationalists if they let the Soviets get to Bandera. Even if they didn't want to work with Bandera, they didn't want to let the Soviets get him and presumably kill him or execute him. But then also Michael Lebed was, of course, also a war criminal and a known international terrorist, because he actually oversaw or was at least accused of by the Polish government of overseeing the assassination of the interior minister of Poland. And something really interesting about that, Ivan Kaczynowski is the one who discovered these documents, but the actual gunman in that case who killed the interior minister of Poland, he didn't go to jail or prison because he escaped the country and he made his way to Latin America. And in 1941, around the time that the Nazis are about to invade the Soviet Union, the Secret Service was alerted to the fact, or at least it believed, that that same gunman was on a mission from the Germans to assassinate FDR. And they actually suspected the this like very high-ranking priest who was sympathetic to the OUN, Ivan Buchko was his name, of sheltering the guy in Philadelphia. And wouldn't you know that like 5 years later, that same priest helps the U.S. government get in touch with Michael Lebed and co., who, of course, Lebed was that same gunman's former superior. And it's just wild. I don't know. And then 40 years after that, you've got Bandera's loyal deputy who doesn't turn against him and also wasn't supported by the CIA. Yaroslav Stetsko, he gets the last laugh, and he's making a speech in the Roosevelt Hotel in New York City in 1981. So it's all just crazy.
The Stetsko got to testify in front of the House Un-American McCarthy's.
Yes. Mm-hmm. What another irony about that is that the House Un-American Activities Committee was largely started with the Dives Committee in the 30s, and it was right at the outbreak of World War II that Martin Dives, who was sort of like the Joseph McCarthy of his day, came out and said he wanted to force the disclosure of the records of the Communist Party, or the U.S. Communist Party, and the German American Bund. What really inspired him to do that was the testimony of the editor of Svoboda, not to be confused with today's neo-Nazi political party of the same name. The word means freedom or liberty, but Svoboda is the name of the oldest Ukrainian language newspaper in the United States, and it started as a largely socialist organ, but by the 30s, it was extremely anti-communist, and the former editor-in-chief of it went to the Dies Committee, and he testified that that Svoboda and to a large extent the Ukrainian American community was under the influence of the OUN leadership in Berlin. They were fundraising for them and all this stuff, and Dies and others believed him and made statements such as saying, because the OUN had a branch in the United States, which is still around. The original OUN called the Organization of Defense, or Organization for the Rebirth of Ukraine, and the OUNB created its other, in 1946, created its own branch in the U.S. called the Organization for the Defense of Four Freedoms of Ukraine. But the first one, like I said, was called out, like one of the original inceptions of the House Un-American Activities, when it was investigating Nazi espionage in the United States. It was called out as a total, front for the Nazis. And then, almost 20 years later, a former McCarthy aide who part in grilling Paul Robeson for being un-American, to which they're asking Paul Robeson, oh, why don't you just go to Russia and stay there? And he's saying, I'm going to because, my father was a slave, and I'm trying to fight what I see as the rising neo-fascist cause in this committee. And then, soon after that, Stetsko is there before the House Un-American Activities Committee, first time in the United States, and they're telling him he's a great guy and a fantastic leader. So it's all just...
Were they able to commit any acts of sabotage within the Soviet Union? If so, what?
So, yes, especially in the first years. I think by the 50s, early 1950s, the Ukrainian nationalist, anti-Soviet resistance movement was pretty much wiped out, and the Soviet Union used typical kind of Stalin to take care of that problem. They sent hundreds of thousands of people to Siberia, and just a whisper of a rumor of association Ukrainian nationalists could. But especially in the immediate years after World War II, and I guess as the Soviets were advancing on Berlin, the UPA did assassinate a lot of Soviet officials, particularly the secret police. But overall, the sectors of the U.S. government and others who supported the Ukrainian nationalists, for the most part, really overinflated their potential to have their revolution or whatever. There were some CIA analysts who determined by the turn of the 50s to play no serious role if and when there was a war with the Soviet Union, because that was the whole justification for supporting them, is that so many people believed late 40s that World War III was imminent. So that was the point of supporting them. I mean, I think a big reason that a lot of this history is sort of hidden and kind of swept under the rug is that, at least from the perspective of the powers that be in the United States, is that not only was this history, this relationship embarrassing because you're dealing with war criminals and Nazi collaborators, but it was a total failure. And at the end of the day, did nothing to benefit the American people in really any way whatsoever.
Obviously, a lot of it, I've never seen the CIA benefit anyone with something banana corporations. But can you tell me what happened in the turn of the 60s? Okay.
Well, I would say because by the, so the CIA, as I said, as I think of it, the OUNB basically split in two in 1948, in the summer of 48, at which point the CIA really enthusiastically throughout the Cold War supported the quote-unquote anti-Bandera faction, or the quote-unquote moderate faction of the OUNB, whereas the British soon after that got behind Bandera and Stetsko for a few years. Even they realized that Bandera's group was useless, and especially his faction was totally infiltrated by the Soviets' intelligence, to the point where they speculated that his entire network was turned, which is a whole other dimension of this. But the point is that they were dropped. Bandera was dropped by Western intelligence by the mid to late 50s, and he was assassinated in 59, at which point Stetsko basically emerged as the new leader of that faction. Just kind of in the 50s, sort of when McCarthyism was on the decline, as I've read one, I can't remember who said this, but as they put it, McCarthyism sort of metastasized in the private sector as it was repudiated in Congress and elsewhere. And sort of the same thing with support for, at least in the case of Ukraine's Nazi collaborators and the OUNB, is that when they were ditched by Western governments is when they ended up linking up with all these private anti-communist groups. Their support in the United States almost kind of took off more without the CIA.
So who were the private groups
supporting them? I think the main thing is that, so in 1946, Yaroslav Stetsko created, or the OUNB created and put Stetsko as the leader for life of this thing called the Anti-Bolshevik Bloc of Nations, which was basically a coalition of the like-minded groups, anti-Soviet groups, and nationalities that basically held themselves to be the legitimate government in exile for what they called the captive nations of the Soviet Union. And so that, was not just Eastern Europe, it was the Baltics and some Asian groups in the Caucasus Caucasus region. And but a large part of that came from Gerhard von Mend, who was a leading advisor in Alfred Rosenberg's Nazi Ministry of the Occupied Eastern Territories. They created these like national committees, and a lot of those were recycled afterwards and joined the ABN, or the Anti-Bolshevik Bloc of Nations, and in the 50s, Stetsko went to Taiwan and made a deal with the Asian People's Anti-Communist League. And together, by the mid-60s, they created what became the World Anti-Communist League, which kind of just like brought together some of the most unsavory anti-communists around the world, including a lot of death squads from Central America and stuff. But in terms of in the US, in the year Bandera was killed in 1959, earlier that summer, the United States government signed into law Captive Nations Week, and a accompanying Captive Nations resolution, which was a whole symbolic effort meant to commit the United States to liberate all the communist, quote-unquote, captive nations of the world. The guy who wrote that resolution and then created and led the National Captive Nations Committee for decades to oversee the annual Captive Nations Week celebrations, which continue to this day every third week of July. The U.S. president, since Eisenhower, every year since '59, has declared third week of July Captive Nations Week. And it's a really absurd thing that it continues today. The guy who created that was named Lev Dobryansky, and he was also the longtime leader of the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America. And he was like a free market economist and just generally like far right politically. He was extremely well connected, and he was a part of the American Security Council, which I think Wes McClune was his name, characterized it as the personification of the military-industrial complex. It was just full of retired officials from the FBI and CIA and the military and elsewhere. So he had that, and he was also connected to John Birch Society and just all kinds of. The other thing is a lot of people are familiar with the Republican Party's Southern strategy, but they also had a quote unquote ethnic strategy, which, notably did not apply to Jews or Black people, but the Republican National Committee was trying to win over the votes of these anti-Soviet emigre communities. That really got instituted in like the 60s and 70s, but it goes back for that. As for the Ukrainian division, Lev Dobryansky was an early leader of that. So he actually, I don't think anyone knows this, he accused Mykola Lebed, the guy trained by the Gestapo, the CIA was supporting in the 60s, he accused him of being soft on communism. All right, he also got Stetsko his visa to the United States in 1958, when at that point the CIA and the State Department was vehemently opposed to letting him come to this country, and that's how he got to testify before the House Un-American Activities Committee. But I see Lev Dobryansky as a champion of the Bandera people in the United States during the Cold War, and he's kind of the one, in my opinion, who most served to integrate Ukrainian Nazi collaborators, their like-minded Ukrainian nationalists in the United States, with the Republican Party, sectors of the military-industrial complex, and just otherwise far-right anti-communist circles in the United States.
Can we fast forward to the 1980s? And I'm looking at a photo of Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush honoring Yaroslav Stetsko.
Yes. And so at that time, Dobryansky was Reagan's ambassador to the Bahamas.
Holy God!
So he could, which I think was sort of like...
Wait, who was, one more, can you repeat the name of the person who was...
his name, Dr. Lev Dobryansky, Dobriansky. I'm not 100% sure I'm pronouncing
Yep, you got it.
Correct. Yeah, like I said, he also, I think in the 70s, created I can't remember exactly what it was called, but it was sort of like the Republican Ukrainian Association or something like that. So he basically got his spot as at least the Republican leader of the Ukrainian American community to a large extent. So also the year Stetsko made it to the White House, Lev's daughter, Paula, joined the National Security Council, and she's a relatively obscure figure to most people, but she's actually one of the most highly respected neocons today. She was one of the original signatories of the Project for a New American Century, so actually, the thing is, so Stetsko, after a long time, the U.S. government, others, saying he's bad news while they're working with his former allies, is that the World Anti-Communist League basically got connected to the Reagan administration. It got actually involved in the Iran-Contra scandal even. John Singlaub, who was working with Oliver North to arm Contras when that was the point after which Congress had forbade U.S. government sending arms to them, he became the chairman of the World Anti-Communist League in 1984, but that was not before he went and visited Stetsko at his headquarters in Munich, and before he celebrated the UPA's 40th birthday party on Capitol Hill as a guest speaker. So I see the way that Stetsko, long story short, gets to the White House is the World Anti-Communist League really got linked up with the Reagan administration. That's what gave them all that access. But meanwhile, you see, as I said, Dobryansky gets into the administration. And also, someone else who was involved was Dobryansky's mentee, who became an aide in the Reagan White House and had previously served as the executive director of his National Captive Nations Committee. Her name, born Catherine Chumachenko, went on to become the first lady of Ukraine when she married Viktor Yushchenko. And personally, I suspect that she's the one who convinced Yushchenko to declare Bandera a hero of Ukraine, which is like the Ukrainian equivalent of the American Presidential Medal of Freedom. So I see Dobryansky as like a very pivotal figure in this whole history. But the thing is, the CIA really did not like him. Some people who have said that he was working with the CIA, but from what I've seen, the CIA only had like negative things to say about him because he was, as they said, more and more under the influence of the Bandera people.
So now it seems that let's talk about who came into power in Ukraine after the dissolving of the Soviet Union, and how did the Svoboda, and I know it's probably a big question, but how did the Svoboda and the Azov battalion get where they are now?
Okay, so I'll say, I guess, long story short is that far right and the people say neo-Nazis, which like some of them are neo-Nazis, not all of them are neo-Nazis. They were all like very fringe during the 1990s. They saw more prominence as the 2000s and the 2010s came and went. I think Azov is sort of seems to be the ones to watch out for today the most. Whereas, a few years ago, right sector was the one was all the rage. Okay, Svoboda started in the 90s as the Social National Party of Ukraine, as opposed, to the National Socialism. They call themselves Social Nationalists. And they had what's called a Wolf's Angel swastika. Anyone looking at it would think it's like just a poorly or an incomplete swastika. And they claim it's not, that it's just the I and the N superimposed for the idea of the nation. But they were a neo-Nazi party, and that was founded by Svoboda's leader, Olotyanibok, Andrei Paroby, who led its paramilitary branch called the Patriot of Ukraine, he is now Ukraine's Speaker of Parliament. But at that point, the SNPU was, as told by Roman Sobchanik, was in 1999, this guy wrote that the SNPU was the least influential of the three main parties on the radical right of Ukraine, one of them being the Congress of Ukrainian Nationalists, which was founded by Yaroslav's wife, Yaroslava Stetsko, who was also with him at the White House when he went, and he died in 1986. And so she moved back to Ukraine after independence and created this party, the Congress of Ukrainian Nationalists, which had its own paramilitary branch called Trident. And a leader of Trident is the guy who ended up creating and leading Right Sector. But so in 2004, the SNPU, Social National Party, reinvented itself, kind of like the OUNB did in 1944, where they distanced themselves from their most extreme elements, or some of them, mainly the doing away with the Patriot of Ukraine, their paramilitary branch, and Paroby left and he became a politician. And that's where his whole political career kind of came from. And but the Patriot of Ukraine was then later revived, it as the paramilitary group to another political group called the Social National Assembly, if I haven't got that mistaken. But then they continue to fly the yellow and black Wolf's Angel swastika flag of the SNPU. And so they also joined Right Sector, but then they created Azov, which is today like the most prominent neo-Nazi group in Ukraine and is part of the National Guard. I think it's ironic, or I don't know, it's just history and the way it's interesting how it repeats itself. Is that the Congress of Ukrainian Nationalists, Yaroslava Stetsko's group, which was basically a party of OUNB emigres who went to the West during the Cold War and then returned. One of those co-founders was Roman Zavarich, who was also born in the U.S. and was involved with the World Anti-Communist League and the Anti-Bolshevik Bloc of Nations. And he's now alleged to be one of Azov's liaisons to their international supporters. So it's like interesting how this whole international network seems to still be relevant today in terms of building this support for Azov, which has now got its eyes allegedly on expanding, becoming an international movement.
Seems like the State Department under Hillary Clinton and John Kerry's friendly with these Nazis. Is there any explanation for this?
It'd be interesting to find out a few decades from now when stuff is declassified, the truth of it all. I would like to remind people of, in the same vein that I don't see this history necessarily of Bandera's rehabilitation like a CIA conspiracy as much as CIA blowback. And, a lot of people will say that, the United States government orchestrated a neo-Nazi coup in Kiev. Some people forget that the Obama administration brokered a deal to end the protests that would have kept Yanukovych in power a little longer till early elections could be held. It was a veteran of the Congress of Ukrainian Nationalists, Detsko's group, that went on stage on the Maidan and made the fateful speech saying, Yanukovych, get out or we're going to overthrow you by force. And that's when he fled the country. I think when you listen to the infamous phone call between Victoria Nuland, Assistant Secretary of State, and Jeff Pyatt, the U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine at the time, as Pyatt says to Nuland, we want to try to land jelly side up on this one. So, it spins the democracy promotion strategy of the United States government in times of crises that the United States government swoop in and secure the most influence. I do think the United States government, to some extent, is largely responsible for Russia too. I think both powers kind of manufactured this crisis, but are largely responsible for it, share responsibility for it. But I don't necessarily think the State Department wanted to put neo-Nazis into power. But as Nuland said to Pyatt, she wanted the National Endowment for Democracy supported candidate Yatsenyuk, who's like a center-right politician, to become prime minister, which he did. But as she said, she wanted him talking to Tyanibok, the neo-Nazi Svoboda leader, four times a week, which is more than every other day. And I think really at that point, the Svoboda party was the politics in Ukraine. All the main political parties are so corrupt and have such little popular support. It was Svoboda among the anti-Yanukovych opposition parties that had the most grassroots support. I think they were kind of just working with what they could, but it was, I don't know. It's complicated. They definitely did include them in the mix and greenlighted, I think, Yatsenyuk's welcoming Svoboda into that opposition coalition. But I don't think the United States government wanted a so-called neo-Nazi coup in Kiev.
I guess it's kind of like they didn't really foresee ISIS to a follow-up to Saddam Hussein, but it's kind of like their policies led to that.
I think it's somewhat like that, yeah. And now it's the Azov's leader who says he wants to lead a global crusade against Jews and other so-called subhumans. He's very emboldened by the fact the United States, by that the Ukrainian government, now promotes the rehabilitation of Bandera's memory. It's like the Ukrainian government has really weaponized the rhetoric of the far right, I think, sort of to shore up their own legitimacy and then to crush any political opposition, just using these sort of nationalist slogans. But it's not necessarily because that Poroshenko or necessarily even far right or that enthusiastic about Bandera, but that their grip on power is tenuous enough that, they feel that that's kind of, I guess, what they need to do or what will shore up their power. But it's really, they're just kind of they're building up support for the far right. It's like people talk about a neo-Nazi coup in Ukraine in 2014. I think the more people simplify it to that sort of narrative, is they miss the risk of an actual neo-Nazi coup happening, down the road.
Can Ukraine, do you believe they can fix this neo-Nazi problem they have, or what do you foresee for Ukraine?
I mean, I'm no expert by any means on politics in Ukraine. I don't speak Ukrainian, I don't know the language. So that really limits my ability to really get the proper perspective on what's happening. Because, of course, it's so limited what, is actually available in English, current events in Ukraine and Russia. But I don't know. I mean, it's just personally, I mean, I think, well, rather than what I think, I mean, there's a book, Ukraine and the Empire of Capital, which, as it predicts, Ukraine is in store for another Maidan, which will be much more bloody in all probability.
Can you talk about the snipers and shootout from the 2014 Maidan?
Sure. Yeah. I mentioned Ivan Kachanovsky earlier, who discovered the documents about the alleged German plot involving the OUN assassin to kill Roosevelt. He's also the one who authored the first academic study on the so-called Snipers Massacre. And he basically determined beyond a reasonable doubt that it was a false flag massacre carried out by the far right to seize power. And at this point, I mean, there's large segments of Ukrainian officials today who acknowledge that basically to be true. Or at least that the real shooters were in opposition controlled buildings, and that all the forensics points to a lot of these protesters being shot in the back and stuff like that. It's crazy to think that people of Ukraine really put up with this almost 5 years later, that still no one's been prosecuted for that massacre.
Oh, wow. Okay, I did not know that. Can you just talk about how bloody the massacre is for people who may not be familiar?
It was dozens of people were killed, mostly protesters, unarmed protesters, but then also police, which was like one of the first indications to people that a third party may have been responsible and not government snipers who, as it turns out, were actually trying to shoot the real shooters who were shooting police and protesters. That's like the event that really just made it impossible for people to accept Yanukovych to stay in power, accepting that his administration was responsible for that, when all indications are that they weren't. Not that the Yanukovych wasn't extremely corrupt, that his administration and police weren't abusing people. But yeah, no, I mean, that massacre was not their doing. And it also makes you wonder, though, that the people who got away with it, like, since it was the far right, if they'll just do it again. Or I think very ironic is if they ended up trying to take power, was trying to expose the lies about the massacre and somehow pin it on the current government. Like, I'm still waiting for some major political force in Ukraine to point fingers at somebody.
What was the State Department's official narrative during that time?
I said earlier, I think like the U.S. government wanted to, and again, I'm not really an expert on this. I've been increasingly focusing on the history, but I think they wanted the center-right politicians who were, very friendly and had relations with the State Department. They wanted them to take power. And I think they probably were okay if they didn't. I think they either liked the idea or were okay with the idea of the far right having a role to play. They wanted the center-right politicians to take power, which ultimately they did. But the center-right politicians are catering to the far right.
Of course, center-right always caters to.
Yeah.
And I guess, is the center-right, what is their stance towards NATO?
So these are the people who they wanted by center-right, I mean pro-Western, pro-NATO people in Ukraine, or parties. But ironically, a lot of the far right doesn't even necessarily support NATO or the West. For them, it wasn't the Euromaidan. It wasn't a revolution to join the West. It was to have their long-awaited nationalist revolution, which Azov has openly said many times, basically, that it's just waiting to topple the current government, and they've threatened many times to do so. So I'm not quite sure. I forget what Azov's position is on that, but I think that, the U.S. government is going to find, if Ukraine's far right, if Ukraine were really to have the neo-Nazi coup that Russia has been talking about for years, I think the U.S. government will find that that's a very quote-unquote anti-American government, just as much as it is anti-Russian.
I know I kept you long enough. Do you have anything that you want to discuss that I forgot to ask you about?
I guess that's the main, for me, the main thing is, in terms of this history, is the drama of, that there were two factions. There were two OUNBs, basically, and the U.S. government thought that they could support and uplift the so-called moderate faction of the OUNB. Bandera, beyond the grave, really got the last laugh out of that relationship. And it's not like the CIA or the U.S. government at all necessarily created or is directly responsible for neo-Nazis you see today in Ukraine. It's very hard to imagine, or I think things would have been very different. They had nothing to do with these people in the first place.
Okay. Yeah, I've actually seen Howard Dean and everyone. Like, Howard Dean actually came very close to Holocaust denial at this point. Thank you for bringing a little bit of sanity back to this discussion, and I really hope you continue with your research because I'm learning a lot. How do people find you?
Well, first of all, thank you so much. Also, I have a Twitter, Moss Robison, and then it's like a underscore, but it's my last name. It's spelled like Robeson, pronounced Robison. But also, last night I actually found out that the first academic article I submitted is going to be published. So there's something coming more from me on that. I left school to work on this research project, so it's finally starting to amount to something.
Well, I wish you all the luck in this and keep up the good work. And thanks again for coming. I know we had a little bit of a delay. Hopefully we can get this. We just had a Russia expert, a real Russia expert. Sorry, I'm laughing at, about the internet Russia expert, right? Terrell Star, Russian Star.
Okay, no, I'm not familiar, but I mean, most quote-unquote experts are not experts, I've found.
Exactly. Like, for example, he didn't know what the GRU was. Last week, he quote-unquote accidentally went to this, Jewish cafe that was...
Oh, that one, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that's why I was laughing, because he's a Fulbright scholar and a Russia expert. But
oh, wow.
And so whenever I use Russia expert, it makes me think of him.
Yeah.
Okay, well, have a great rest of the day.
All right, well, thank you.
Bye.